Sometimes life puts us on paths of humiliation to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that house of luxury, I was invisible to everyone, except him. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Dorothy, and today at 85 years old, my heart is full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I went from poverty and humiliation to find true love when everything seemed lost. This story begins in 1960 in the charming but conservative city of Charleston, South Carolina, when I was just 20 years old and made the biggest mistake of my life, a mistake that would haunt me for 65 years. Back then, Charleston was a place where traditions ran deeper than the Ashley River, where every family knew every other family's business, and where a young unmarried woman at 20 was already considered an old maid. I lived in the shadow of my best friend since childhood, Margaret Thompson. She was everything I wasn't, confident, beautiful, from a well-established family. While I worked at my father's small grocery store, counting pennies and dreaming of a different life, Margaret had captured the heart of Robert Harrison, son of the most prosperous merchant in town. Their wedding was the social event of the season. I stood there as her maid of honor, smiling through my heartbreak, because secretly I had always harbored feelings for Robert, but he belonged to Margaret, and I buried those feelings deep in my heart, convinced they would fade with time. How wrong I was. The three of us had grown up together, playing in the same streets, attending the same church, sharing the same dreams of escape from our small-town confines. Robert often spoke of his frustrations with taking over his father's business, his dreams of seeing the world beyond Charleston's historic streets. After their marriage, I became a frequent visitor to their beautiful antebellum home on Rainbow Row. Margaret would often travel to Savannah to care for her ailing mother, leaving Robert and me to share long conversations over coffee. Those talks started innocently enough, discussions about books, dreams, the changing world outside our conservative bubble. But slowly, dangerously, they became something more intimate. Robert confided his marital frustrations, his feeling of being trapped in a life he never chose. I listened, offering comfort, falling deeper into a forbidden emotional connection that would destroy everything I held dear. The first few months of 1960 passed in this dangerous dance of growing intimacy. Margaret trusted me completely, never suspecting that her husband and best friend were crossing lines that should never be crossed. I told myself we were just friends, that nothing physical had happened. But my heart knew the truth. I was falling in love with my best friend's husband, and he was responding to that love in ways that terrified and thrilled me. The guilt ate at me like acid, but I couldn't stop myself. In that conservative world where women had so few choices, Robert's attention felt like the only chance I'd ever have at real love. The moment that changed everything happened on a humid April evening in 1960. Margaret had been in Savannah for a week, and Robert invited me for dinner. We talked until late, sharing wine and confessions under the Spanish moss that draped his front porch. The air was thick with jasmine and unspoken desires. When he walked me to the door, something shifted between us. The careful distance we'd maintained collapsed in a moment of overwhelming passion. He kissed me, and I didn't pull away. In that stolen moment, we crossed a line that would shatter lives and haunt us both forever. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Margaret returned early from Savannah, entering through the back door while Robert and I were embracing in the living room. The sound of her gasp cut through the night air like a knife through my heart. I'll never forget the look in her eyes. Not just betrayal, but a devastation so complete it seemed to drain the life from her face. She stood frozen in the doorway, her traveling bag dropping to the floor, with a sound that echoed like thunder in the sudden silence. "Margaret, I can explain." Robert started, but she held up her hand, tears streaming down her face. What happened next will torment me until my dying day. Through her tears, she whispered the words that shattered my world. "I came home early to tell you. I'm 3 months pregnant." The joy she had carried in her heart, the surprise she had planned for her husband, was destroyed by my betrayal. I watched my best friend's happiness crumble, knowing I was the architect of her devastation. That night, Margaret locked herself in their bedroom, while Robert paced the living room like a caged animal. I stood there, paralyzed by the magnitude of what we had done. The woman who had been my sister in everything but blood was upstairs, dealing with the double blow of her husband's infidelity and the timing of her pregnancy announcement. I knew I had to leave, had to give them space to work through the crisis I had created. But as I walked to the door, Robert grabbed my arm. "Dorothy, we can leave together," he whispered desperately. "We can go to Atlanta, or even New York. Start fresh where nobody knows us." For a moment I was tempted. The thought of escaping with the man I loved, of building a new life away from the judgment and scandal, seemed like the only way forward. But then I heard Margaret crying upstairs, and reality crashed over me like a cold wave. I couldn't run away with her husband. I couldn't be the reason a pregnant woman lost everything. Whatever love Robert and I shared, it was built on betrayal, and no good could come from it. 3 days later, the scandal exploded through Charleston like wildfire in August. In a town where gossip traveled faster than the morning paper, everyone knew about Dorothy Stewart's betrayal of her best friend. I was expelled from my own church, disowned by my parents, and shunned by everyone I had ever known. The worst part wasn't the public humiliation. It was learning that Margaret had lost the baby. The shock and stress of discovering our affair had caused a miscarriage that nearly took her life as well. I packed my few belongings and bought a bus ticket to New York City with the little money I had saved. As the bus pulled away from Charleston, I took one last look at the city that had been my entire world. I was 20 years old, friendless, penniless, and carrying a guilt so heavy it felt like it might crush my chest. I had destroyed my best friend's life, cost an innocent baby its chance at life, and torn apart a family. The woman staring back at me from the bus window was no longer the naive girl who had dreamed of love and adventure. She was someone I barely recognized, someone capable of causing immeasurable pain to the people she loved most. Chapter 2 begins with my arrival in New York City in the summer of 1960, clutching a cardboard suitcase and $23 to my name. The city was a maze of noise, smoke, and strangers. The perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear completely. I found work as a live-in housekeeper for the Wentworth family on the Upper East Side, a wealthy couple with 3 children who needed someone to manage their household while they traveled for business. The work was backbreaking, 14-hour days of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and laundry. But it was exactly the punishment I felt I deserved. Every aching muscle, every sleepless night when the baby cried, every moment of exhaustion was my penance for the lives I had destroyed in Charleston. The Wentworths were kind enough employers, but I kept myself isolated, speaking only when spoken to, living like a ghost in their beautiful home. At night, alone in my tiny room in the servants' quarters, I would write letters to Margaret that I never sent. Pages and pages of apologies, explanations, pleas for forgiveness that I knew she would never read. I saved every penny I could from my meager wages, and once a month I would send $20 in an unmarked envelope to Margaret's address in Charleston. It wasn't nearly enough to compensate for what I had taken from her, but it was all I could do. The 1960s unfolded around me like scenes from a movie I was watching, but not participating in. I witnessed the excitement of Kennedy's presidency, the Cultural Revolution, the changing roles of women, but I remained on the sidelines, convinced I didn't deserve to be part of the world's joy and progress. The Wentworth children grew up before my eyes, and I poured all my suppressed maternal instincts into caring for them, knowing I would never have children of my own. In 1965, Mrs. Wentworth noticed my dedication and suggested I might consider furthering my education. "Dorothy, you're too intelligent to spend your life scrubbing floors," she said kindly. "Have you ever thought about nursing? You have such a gentle way with people when they're hurt or sick." The idea terrified and intrigued me in equal measure. Could someone like me, someone who had caused so much pain, really dedicate her life to healing others? I started taking night classes at a community college, while continuing to work for the Wentworths during the day. The coursework was challenging, but for the first time in years, I felt my mind engaging with something meaningful. I discovered I had an aptitude for biology and anatomy, and more importantly, I found that caring for people in their most vulnerable moments gave me a sense of purpose I had never experienced. The professors at nursing school saw potential in me that I couldn't see in myself. Professor Martinez, who taught obstetrics, pulled me aside after a particularly difficult exam. "Miss Stewart, you have natural instincts for this work. Have you considered specializing in obstetric nursing? You have a gift for comforting women during childbirth." The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had caused the loss of an unborn child was being called to help bring babies safely into the world. By 1970, at the age of 30, I had earned my nursing degree and specialized in obstetric care. I took a position at Bellevue Hospital, working in the maternity ward where I would spend the next phase of my life. Every birth I assisted, every mother I comforted, every healthy baby I placed in grateful arms was a prayer of atonement for the child lost because of my actions. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, but it gave my life meaning in a way I had never imagined possible. My colleagues respected my skill and dedication, though they knew little about my personal life. I lived simply in a small apartment near the hospital, sending money home to Charleston every month and living for my work. When other nurses talked about their families, their boyfriends, their weekend plans, I would listen politely but never contribute. I had convinced myself that I didn't deserve the normal pleasures of life: love, marriage, children of my own. But working in the maternity ward began to change something fundamental in me. Witnessing the miracle of birth day after day, seeing the pure joy on parents' faces as they held their newborns, started to chip away at the wall of guilt I had built around my heart. Maybe, I began to think, redemption was possible. Maybe God could use even someone like me to bring good into the world. It would take many more years before I truly believed it, but the seed of hope was finally planted in the sterile halls of that busy New York hospital. The decade of the 1970s found me fully established in my nursing career, working the night shift at Bellevue Hospital's maternity ward. I had become known among my colleagues as someone who could handle the most difficult deliveries, the most frightened first-time mothers, the emergencies that sent other nurses running for doctors. My supervisor, Helen Rodriguez, often said I had hands that could calm any laboring woman, and a voice that could talk anyone through their darkest moment of pain. What Helen didn't know was that every woman I comforted, every successful delivery I assisted, was an offering on the altar of my guilt. I had taken life from Margaret's womb through my betrayal, and now I dedicated my existence to bringing life safely into the world. The mathematics of redemption consumed me. How many babies would I need to deliver to balance the scales? How many mothers would I need to comfort to earn forgiveness for the tears I had caused my best friend? In 1975, I received news that shattered the routine I had built around my penance. A letter from my sister Martha, the first family communication I had received in 15 years, informed me that our father was dying. The man who had disowned me in the aftermath of the scandal was asking for me to come home. The letter was brief and formal, but between the lines, I could read Martha's struggle with whether to even contact me at all. The decision to return to Charleston, even temporarily, felt like walking voluntarily into a furnace. 15 years had passed since I fled in disgrace, but small southern towns have long memories, and I knew the whispers would follow me down every familiar street. I requested a leave of absence from the hospital and bought a plane ticket to South Carolina, my hands shaking as I packed clothes I hadn't worn since leaving New York. Conservative dresses suitable for a Charleston funeral. The flight to Charleston was the longest 2 hours of my life. As the plane descended over the city where I was born, I saw the Ashley and Cooper rivers meeting to form the Atlantic, the church spires reaching toward heaven, the grand antebellum homes that had defined my childhood dreams. It was still beautiful, still gracious, but I was no longer the young woman who had once believed she belonged in that picture-perfect world. Martha met me at the airport, and the years fell away as we embraced. She was grayer, more lined around the eyes, but her hug felt like home in a way I had forgotten was possible. During the drive to the family house, she updated me on 15 years of family news. Marriages, births, deaths, the ordinary progression of life that had continued in my absence. She was careful not to mention Margaret or Robert, but their names hung in the air between us like smoke. The funeral home visitation was an ordeal I'll never forget. Walking into that room where my father lay in his casket, surrounded by flowers and the faces of people who had known me since childhood, felt like stepping into a courtroom where I was simultaneously the defendant and the evidence of my own crime. Some people turned away when they saw me. Others stared with undisguised curiosity. A few, mostly older church ladies who had known my mother, approached with cautious kindness. But the moment that changed everything happened near the end of the visitation. I was standing alone by my father's casket, saying a silent goodbye to the man whose disappointment in me had been almost as devastating as my own guilt, when I felt someone approach beside me. I looked up to see Margaret Thompson Harrison, 15 years older but still beautiful, dressed in simple black and carrying a small bouquet of white roses. "Hello, Dorothy," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the anger I had expected. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was always kind to me." We stood there in silence for a moment, two middle-aged women who had once been inseparable, now separated by a chasm of hurt and time. When she placed her flowers next to the casket and turned to leave, I found my voice. "Margaret, I started, but she stopped me with a gentle shake of her head. "Not here, Dorothy. Not now. But if you'd like to talk before you leave town, I'll be at Magnolia Cemetery tomorrow at 2 o'clock, visiting my baby's grave. You're welcome to join me if you want to." With that, she walked away, leaving me stunned by an invitation I had never dared hope for. The next afternoon, I found Margaret sitting on a small bench beside a tiny gravestone marked Baby Harrison, born into heaven, April 15th, 1960. She looked up as I approached, patting the bench beside her in a gesture that was achingly familiar from our childhood. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching Spanish moss sway in the old oak trees, listening to the distant sound of church bells marking the hour. "I know it was you sending the money," Margaret said finally, her voice soft but clear. $20 every month for 15 years. I never spent it. It's all in a bank account." She paused, pulling a tissue from her purse. "At first, I was angry that you thought money could fix what happened. But as the years passed, I realized it wasn't about the money at all. It was about your guilt, your need to do something, anything, to show your remorse." I couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down my face as I stared at the small gravestone, finally able to mourn the child whose death I had caused. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," I whispered. "I destroyed everything. Your marriage, your baby, your happiness. I've spent 15 years trying to figure out how to make it right, but nothing I do can bring back what you lost because of me." Margaret was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. "Robert and I divorced 2 years after you left. The marriage couldn't survive what happened, but Dorothy, I need you to know something. The baby, the doctors said the miscarriage was caused by a condition I had, not by the shock of discovering the affair. The timing made it seem connected, and I let everyone believe that, but medically, it wasn't your fault. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. 15 years of believing I was responsible for an innocent child's death. 15 years of punishing myself for a tragedy that wasn't actually caused by my actions. The guilt I had carried like a stone in my chest began to shift, creating space for something I hadn't felt in years. The possibility of forgiveness. Maybe even self-forgiveness. I've remarried," Margaret continued. "A good man, a teacher. We have 2 children together. I've built a happy life, Dorothy. Your betrayal hurt me terribly, and it took years to trust anyone again. But it didn't destroy me. I want you to know that, because I think you've been destroying yourself with guilt over something that, while wrong, wasn't the catastrophe you believed it to be." We talked for another hour in that quiet cemetery, 15 years of silence finally broken by honest conversation. When I told her about my work as an obstetric nurse, about the hundreds of babies I had helped deliver, Margaret smiled for the first time since I had seen her again. "You found your calling," she said. "Maybe God used what happened to put you exactly where you needed to be." As I prepared to return to New York the next day, Margaret made me a promise that would change the trajectory of my life once again. "There's going to be an opening for a head obstetric nurse at Charleston General Hospital next year," she said. "My husband knows the chief of staff. If you ever want to come home, Dorothy, really come home, let me know. It's time you stopped punishing yourself and started living again." The plane ride back to New York was different from my journey south. Instead of dread and guilt, I felt something I barely recognized. Hope. The conversation with Margaret hadn't erased the past or made my betrayal disappear, but it had opened a door I thought was permanently closed. For the first time in 15 years, I began to consider the possibility that I might deserve a second chance at life, love, and happiness. But first, I had to learn how to forgive myself, a task that would prove even more difficult than earning Margaret's forgiveness. The year 1985 marked a turning point that I never could have anticipated. At 45 years old, I made the decision to leave New York and return to Charleston, accepting the position at Charleston General Hospital that Margaret had mentioned. The transition felt like stepping back in time, but also like moving forward into a future I had never dared imagine for myself. Charleston had changed in the 25 years since I left. The city had grown more cosmopolitan, more accepting of different lifestyles and past mistakes. The rigid social structures that had once seemed unbreakable had softened around the edges. Most importantly, I had changed. I was no longer the frightened, guilt-ridden young woman who had fled in disgrace. I was a respected nurse with decades of experience, returning home with skills that the community needed. My first day at Charleston General was nerve-wracking, but the medical staff welcomed me professionally. My reputation from Bellevue had preceded me, and within weeks I was training younger nurses and implementing new protocols for high-risk deliveries. The work gave me confidence and purpose. But more than that, it gave me a place in Charleston society that wasn't defined by my past mistakes. Margaret kept her word about friendship, though we both understood it would never be the easy, carefree relationship we had shared as children. We met occasionally for coffee, updating each other on our lives with the careful politeness of former intimates learning to be friends again. She had indeed built a beautiful life with her teacher husband, and their 2 children were bright, kind teenagers who called me Miss Dorothy when we met at church functions. It was at one of these church functions in 1987 that I met Dr. William Chen, the new chief of cardiology at the hospital. William was a widower, originally from California, who had moved to Charleston to escape the painful memories of his wife's death from cancer. He was quiet, intelligent, and carried his own burden of grief with a dignity that I recognized and respected. Our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual understanding of loss and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving personal tragedy. William knew my full story. I had learned to be honest about my past rather than hiding from it. Instead of judging me, he admired the way I had transformed guilt into purpose, pain into compassion. "You've spent 27 years punishing yourself for one mistake made when you were young," he said during one of our long walks through the historic district. "Don't you think it's time to let yourself be happy?" The question terrified me. Happiness had seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, a betrayal of the penance I owed for my past. But slowly, William's gentle persistence and the evidence of my own healing work began to convince me that maybe, just maybe, I deserved a second chance at love. When he proposed in 1989, I said yes through tears of joy and disbelief. Our wedding was small but meaningful, held in the garden of Margaret's home with her blessing and participation. She served as my matron of honor, a gesture of forgiveness so complete it took my breath away. As I stood there in my simple blue dress, holding hands with a man who knew all my flaws and loved me anyway, I felt something I had never expected to experience: complete acceptance of myself and my right to happiness. Marriage to William brought me into his family circle, which included his adult children from his first marriage, and their children. At 50, I suddenly found myself a stepmother and step-grandmother to people who welcomed me with open arms. The children called me Grandma Dorothy, and their easy affection helped heal wounds I didn't even know I still carried. The 1990s brought a sense of completion to my life that I had never dared hope for. William and I worked together at the hospital, he in cardiology and I in obstetrics, often consulting on cases involving pregnant women with heart conditions. Our professional partnership strengthened our personal bond, and colleagues often commented on how well we complemented each other's skills and temperaments. In 1995, our step-grandson, Michael, announced his intention to study medicine, inspired by watching William and me work. "I want to help people the way you and Grandpa do," he said, and I felt a surge of pride and purpose that connected my past suffering to future healing. The boy who called me Grandma was choosing a path of service, partly because of my example, creating ripples of good that extended far beyond my own life. As the century drew to a close, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the scared, guilty 20-year-old fleeing Charleston in disgrace to a respected nurse, beloved wife, and cherished grandmother figure. The path had been long and painful, but every step had been necessary to bring me to this place of peace and purpose. William and I often talked about retirement, but we weren't ready to stop working. The hospital had become our second home, and the work of bringing life into the world still felt like my calling. We made plans to travel, to visit his children in California, to spend more time in the garden of our historic Charleston home. The future, which had once seemed like a punishment to be endured, now looked like a gift to be savored. But life, as I had learned so many times before, has its own plans for us, and the next decade would bring challenges that would test everything I had learned about love, loss, and the courage to keep serving others, even when our own strength begins to fail. The new millennium brought changes I never anticipated. At 60, I was still working full-time at Charleston General, but I began to notice William showing signs of the heart disease he had spent his career treating in others. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The cardiologist who had saved countless hearts was losing his own battle with cardiac deterioration. William's diagnosis in 2002 forced us both to confront mortality in a way we had managed to avoid during our happy years together. The man who had taught me to love again, who had shown me that I deserved happiness despite my past, was facing the same kind of devastating illness that had taken his first wife. The symmetry was cruel, but William faced it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. I took early retirement to become his primary caregiver, a role reversal that initially frustrated him, but eventually deepened our bond in unexpected ways. I spent my career telling other people how to take care of their hearts, he said during one of his better days. Now I get to learn what it feels like to have someone take care of mine. The months of caring for him taught me that love isn't just about the joyful moments, but about the willingness to witness and ease each other's suffering. William passed away peacefully in 2005, holding my hand in the same garden where we had been married 16 years earlier. At his memorial service, I was surrounded by the extended family he had given me, his children, grandchildren, colleagues, and patients whose lives he had touched. Margaret sat beside me, offering silent support as I grieved the second great love of my life. The years following William's death could have been a time of retreat and isolation, but his influence had changed me too fundamentally for that. Instead, I threw myself back into volunteer work at the hospital, training new nurses and serving as a mentor to young women entering the profession. I also began visiting nursing homes, offering comfort to elderly patients who reminded me of my own journey through loss and recovery. In 2010, at age 70, I received an honor I never could have imagined. The Charleston Medical Society named me Nurse of the Year, recognizing 5 decades of service to mothers and babies in the community. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, I saw Margaret in the audience, tears streaming down her face, applauding the woman who had once been her greatest source of pain and had become a source of pride. My acceptance speech was brief, but heartfelt. This award belongs to every woman who trusted me with her most precious moments, every baby I helped bring safely into the world, and every colleague who taught me that healing others is the best way to heal ourselves. We all make mistakes, but we don't have to let those mistakes define the rest of our story. The speech was reported in the Charleston newspaper, and I received letters from women I had cared for over the decades. Mothers thanking me for my gentle hands during their labor, families grateful for my compassion during difficult deliveries, young nurses I had mentored who were now training the next generation. Reading those letters, I finally understood something William had tried to tell me years earlier. My past mistake hadn't disqualified me from doing good in the world. It had prepared me to do good with deeper empathy and humility. As I entered my 70s, I began to experience something unprecedented in my adult life: contentment with who I had become. The guilt that had driven me for so many decades had transformed into wisdom, the shame into compassion, the self-punishment into self-acceptance. I wasn't the same person who had betrayed her best friend 50 years earlier, but I wasn't trying to pretend that person had never existed either. Margaret and I had grown closer in our old age, bonding over shared memories of our youth and mutual pride in the lives we had built from the ashes of our broken friendship. Her grandchildren knew me as Miss Dorothy, and sometimes I would catch them looking at us with curiosity, unable to imagine that these 2 elderly women sipping tea together had once been at the center of the biggest scandal their grandparents' generation could remember. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, I was 80 years old and should have been staying safely at home. Instead, I found myself putting on scrubs once again, volunteering at the hospital during the worst public health crisis of our lifetime. The administrators tried to talk me out of it, citing my age and vulnerability, but I had lived through too much to be sidelined by fear. "I've been preparing for this my whole career," I told the hospital director. "I know how to comfort frightened people, how to be present during life and death moments, how to keep working when everything seems hopeless. You need experienced hands, and mine are still steady. Working alongside healthcare heroes 60 years younger than me, I rediscovered the sense of purpose that had sustained me through all my darkest moments. The pandemic also brought an unexpected gift. Video calls with William's grandchildren, now adults with children of their own, who wanted their kids to know Great-Grandma Dorothy. Seeing those beautiful faces on my computer screen, hearing them call me family, knowing that my story had become part of their family history in a positive way, felt like the final piece of redemption I had been unconsciously seeking. As I sat in my Charleston home during the quieter moments of the pandemic, surrounded by photos spanning 8 decades of life, I began to think seriously about telling my complete story, not as a confession or an apology, but as a testament to the power of redemption, the possibility of rebuilding a life after devastating mistakes, and the truth that our worst moments don't have to define our legacy. Now, at 85, living in the same city where my story began, I finally have the courage to share what I've learned, that forgiveness is possible, that second chances can be even more beautiful than first chances, and that sometimes the path through shame and guilt leads to a depth of compassion and service that wouldn't have been possible any other way. The scared 20-year-old who fled Charleston in 1960 couldn't have imagined the woman I would become, but every step of the journey, even the most painful ones, was necessary to get me here. The final chapter of my story begins with a phone call that came last month, just as I was settling into what I thought would be a quiet retirement. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Martinez, the current head of obstetrics at Charleston General Hospital, the same position I had held for 15 years before my final retirement in 2020. "Miss Dorothy," she said, her voice filled with the same respect I had heard from younger nurses throughout my career. "We're planning a symposium on compassionate care in obstetrics, and we want to honor the pioneers who shaped our profession. Would you consider being our keynote speaker? We'd love for you to share your insights on what you've learned from 50 years of caring for mothers and babies." The request both honored and terrified me. Standing before an audience of medical professionals, sharing the wisdom I had gained through decades of service, felt like the culmination of a journey I never could have planned. But it also meant being completely honest about how that journey began, with a betrayal that had nearly destroyed 2 lives and changed the course of everyone involved. I spent weeks preparing my speech, wrestling with how much of my personal story to include. In the end, I decided to tell it all. The mistake, the guilt, the decades of penance, the slow path to redemption, and the unexpected joy I had found in service to others. If my story could help even one person understand that their worst mistakes don't have to be their final chapter, it would be worth the vulnerability. The day of the symposium, I stood before an audience of 200 healthcare professionals, looking out at faces that reminded me of my younger self. Idealistic, dedicated, but also struggling with the weight of responsibility that comes with holding other people's lives in your hands. Margaret sat in the front row, now 85 herself, having insisted on attending despite her own health challenges. 55 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I made a mistake that I believed had disqualified me from ever doing good in the world again. I betrayed my best friend, contributed to the loss of her marriage, and fled my hometown in shame. I was convinced that someone capable of causing such pain could never be trusted with the sacred work of bringing life into the world. I told them about my years of self-imposed exile, my decision to enter nursing as a form of penance, and the gradual realization that my capacity for causing pain had actually prepared me to prevent and ease pain in others. I shared stories of difficult deliveries, frightened mothers, and the countless moments when my own experience of suffering had helped me connect with patients in their darkest hours. The guilt I carried for decades taught me humility, I continued. The shame I felt made me more sensitive to the shame and fear I saw in young mothers facing unplanned pregnancies, The forgiveness I eventually received from my friend, and finally from myself, taught me how to offer that same forgiveness to patients who were struggling with their own regrets and mistakes. When I finished speaking, the auditorium was silent for a moment before erupting in sustained applause. But what moved me most was seeing tears in the eyes of young nurses and doctors, recognizing something of their own struggles in my story. During the reception afterward, several people approached me with their own stories of mistakes, guilt, and the search for redemption through service. One young resident, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, stayed until nearly everyone else had left. "Miss Dorothy," she said, "I made a mistake last year that nearly cost a patient her life. I've been carrying so much guilt that I've been thinking about leaving medicine altogether. But hearing your story, maybe my mistake doesn't have to be the end of my ability to help people. Maybe it can be the beginning of helping them better." That conversation reminded me why I had chosen to tell my complete story, despite the vulnerability it required. If my 65-year journey from shame to service could help one young doctor find her way back to her calling, then every moment of the struggle had been worthwhile. As I write this final chapter sitting in the sunroom of my Charleston home, I can see the harbor where ships have carried people away from this city and brought them home again for centuries. I think about the young woman who left on a bus in 1960, carrying nothing but guilt and $23, and I marvel at the circuitous path that brought her back as an honored member of the community she had once scandalized. Margaret and I had lunch yesterday at our favorite cafe on King Street, the same street where we used to window shop as teenagers, dreaming of our futures. We're both widows now, both great-grandmothers, both survivors of more joys and sorrows than we could have imagined in our youth. The friendship we rebuilt in our middle age has deepened into something precious and irreplaceable in our final years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked me over coffee, referring not to our rekindled friendship, but to the original betrayal that had shaped both our lives so dramatically. It was a question we had never directly addressed, even after all these years of careful reconciliation. I considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the pain I caused you," I said finally. "I regret the loss of trust, the years of separation, the way it affected your first marriage. But I can't regret the person it ultimately helped me become, or the work I was able to do because of what I learned from my own capacity for causing harm." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I think," she said slowly, "that we both became better people because of what happened. Not because the betrayal was good, but because we chose to let it teach us something about forgiveness, resilience, and the possibility of redemption. Your mistake didn't define your life, Dorothy. How you responded to it did. As I prepare to share this story with the world, I want to end with the most important lesson I've learned in 85 years of living. Our mistakes, no matter how devastating they seem at the time, are not our final verdict. The young woman who betrayed her best friend became a nurse who saved lives. The friendship that seemed permanently destroyed became deeper and more meaningful than it had ever been in its innocent beginning. The guilt that nearly crushed me became the foundation for a compassion that served thousands of families over 5 decades. I don't know how much time I have left on this earth, but I know how I want to spend it. Continuing to share what I've learned about second chances, continuing to support the young healthcare workers who remind me of my younger self, and continuing to treasure the relationships that have survived and thrived despite being tested by betrayal and time. To anyone reading this who is carrying guilt over past mistakes, who believes they don't deserve happiness or redemption, who thinks their worst moment defines their worth, I want you to know that your story isn't over. Mine wasn't over at 20 when I fled Charleston, in shame. It wasn't over at 30 when I was scrubbing floors in penance. It wasn't over at 40 when I thought I would spend my life alone. Some of the most beautiful chapters of my life were written in the decades after my greatest failure. Your mistakes are part of your story, but they don't have to be the end of it. There is always time for redemption, always room for second chances, always hope for a future more beautiful than anything you can imagine from the depths of your current shame or sorrow. I am living proof that a life can be redeemed, that love can be found again, and that sometimes the very thing that breaks us becomes the foundation for our greatest service to others. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story has touched your heart and shown you that it's never too late for redemption and second chances. If you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us reach more people who might need to hear these stories of hope and healing. Every day we bring you new, inspiring stories about life, love, and the power of forgiveness. So feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, I'd love to know what you thought of my story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story that will remind you of the beauty that can emerge from life's greatest challenges.